June 8, 1945. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The war was over. The telegrams had arrived 3 weeks earlier, carried by jeeps that kicked up dust as they rolled through the camp gates. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. For most of the prisoners, the news brought relief, the kind of relief that comes after years of holding your breath, waiting for a disaster you knew was inevitable. But for one man, a soldier named Martin Keller, 34 years old, a carpenter from a village outside Stuttgart, the end of the war brought something else entirely: terror. Because going home meant returning to nothing. His village had been bombed. His family was scattered, possibly dead. His country was occupied, divided, destroyed. And even if he could find his way back to the rubble that had once been his life, what would he be returning to? A defeated nation, a broken economy, a people who would spend the next generation living with the shame of what they had done in the name of a Führer who had promised them glory and delivered only ashes. Martin stood at the edge of the camp, staring at the flat Kansas horizon, and thought, what if I just stayed? If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about escape. It's not about rebellion or resistance. It's about a man who crossed an ocean as a prisoner of war and discovered something he had never expected to find in captivity: home. Not the place he was born, not the country he had fought for, but something deeper, something he didn't even know he had been searching for until the moment he found it. This is the story of a soldier who chose exile over return, who chose the enemy's land over his own, who looked at freedom and said, no, thank you. I'd rather stay here. And in doing so, discovered that sometimes the cage isn't what traps you, it's everything outside of it. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of a man standing at a crossroads, choosing a future that made no sense to anyone but him. And in that choice, finding the only kind of peace that mattered. The camp sat on the edge of farmland, a sprawling complex of barracks and mess halls and guard towers that had housed over 4,000 German prisoners at its peak. But now, in the summer of 1945, the population was shrinking. Every week another group of prisoners was processed, given papers, loaded onto trains, and sent back to Germany, back to the rubble, back to the occupation, back to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful way. Martin watched them go. He watched men pack their few belongings: letters from home, photographs, small handmade trinkets carved from wood or stone during the long, empty hours of captivity. He watched them line up at the gates, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that they might find their families alive. Dread that they might not. But Martin didn't pack. He didn't line up. He just worked. Every day, he reported to the carpentry workshop on the edge of the camp, a small building with tools and lumber and the smell of sawdust that reminded him of his father's shop back home. He built furniture for the guards. He repaired barracks. He made cabinets, tables, chairs. Simple, honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. The workshop supervisor was a man named Harold Brennan, a local contractor who had been hired by the camp to oversee the prisoners' labor projects. Harold was in his 50s, with graying hair and hands scarred by decades of work. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He and Martin communicated in the language of wood and nails and measurements, a language that transcended borders and wars, and all the things that had brought them to this moment. One afternoon, as Martin sanded the legs of a table, Harold walked over and stood there, watching him work. Martin glanced up, wondering if he had done something wrong, but Harold just nodded and said, "You're good at this." Martin shrugged. "My father taught me, before the war." "You miss him?" Martin paused. "I don't know. I haven't seen him in 6 years. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he's alive. I don't know which would be worse." Harold didn't respond. He just stood there for another moment, then walked away, leaving Martin alone with his thoughts and the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper against wood. That night, Martin lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around him, the barracks were emptier than they had been in years. The rows of bunks that had once been packed with men were now mostly vacant, the mattresses stripped, the lockers empty. It felt like the end of something. Not just the war, but the entire world Martin had known. He thought about his village, about the house where he had grown up, with its sloped roof and small garden where his mother had grown vegetables. He thought about the church where he had been baptized, the school where he had learned to read, the pub where he and his friends had drunk beer and told stories and believed they would live forever. But all of it was gone now. Or if it wasn't gone, it was so changed that it might as well be. And the thought of returning to that, of walking through streets he no longer recognized, of searching for people who might not exist anymore, of rebuilding a life from nothing, filled him with a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He closed his eyes and thought, what if I just stayed here? It was a crazy thought. Impossible. The war was over. He was a prisoner. He had to go home. That's what prisoners did. They went home. But the thought wouldn't leave him, because the truth was, Martin didn't want to go home. He wanted to stay here, in this strange, flat, impossibly vast country where no one knew him, where no one cared what he had done during the war, where he could just work and build things and maybe, start over. They called it repatriation, the official term for sending prisoners back to their home countries. It was supposed to be a relief, a return to normalcy, a chance to rebuild lives that had been interrupted by war. But for many German prisoners, repatriation felt less like freedom and more like exile, because the Germany they were being sent back to wasn't the Germany they had left. It was a country divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by foreign powers, a country where cities were rubble, where infrastructure was destroyed, where the economy had collapsed, a country where millions of people were homeless, starving, traumatized. And beyond the physical destruction, there was the psychological devastation, the shame, the guilt, the knowledge that they had fought for a regime that had committed genocide, that had started a war that killed tens of millions of people, that had brought nothing but suffering to the world. Going home meant confronting all of that. It meant living in a country where the swastika had been torn down and replaced with the flags of occupiers, where former Nazis were being hunted and tried and executed, where everyone was suspect, everyone was guilty, everyone was tainted by association. But here, in America, the prisoners were just prisoners. They weren't war criminals. They weren't symbols of evil. They were just men who had been on the wrong side of history and were now paying the price. And for many of them, that was a kind of freedom. Martin had spent 3 years in Camp Concordia, 3 years of routine, of work, of slowly learning English and American customs and all the strange, small things that made this country so different from the one he had left behind. He had learned about baseball, about jazz, about the concept of personal space that Americans seem to value so highly. He had learned to say please and thank you and yes sir in a language that felt foreign on his tongue but was slowly becoming familiar. And in those 3 years something had shifted inside him. He had stopped thinking of himself as a German soldier in captivity and started thinking of himself as, what? A carpenter, a worker, a man trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. One evening, Harold invited Martin to his house for dinner. It was an unusual gesture. Fraternization between guards and prisoners was discouraged, if not outright forbidden. But the war was over, and the rules were changing. Harold's wife, a woman named Margaret with kind eyes and a gentle voice, served pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans. It was the kind of meal Martin hadn't eaten since before the war, the kind of meal that reminded him of Sunday dinners at his parents' house. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clink of forks against plates. Then Harold said, "You thinking about going home?" Martin set down his fork. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "I don't know if I have a home to go back to." Margaret glanced at Harold, then back at Martin. "What about your family?" "I haven't heard from them in 2 years. The last letter I got said the village had been bombed. I don't know if they're alive. I don't know if there's anything left." Harold nodded slowly. "So what will you do?" Martin looked down at his plate. "I don't know," he said again, "but I think I might stay here, if they'll let me." Margaret's eyes widened. "Stay? In America?" "Yes. But you're a prisoner." "Not for much longer. The war is over. Eventually they'll release us, and when they do, I can apply to stay, to immigrate." Harold leaned back in his chair, studying Martin. "You really want that? To stay here? In a country that was your enemy?" Martin thought for a moment. Then he said, "This country was never my enemy. I was just told it was. But the people here, you, Margaret, the guards, the farmers I worked with, you've treated me better than my own government ever did. You fed me. You paid me. You gave me work that had meaning. Why would I go back to a country that lied to me, that used me, that destroyed everything I loved? Why wouldn't I stay here?" The room was silent. Margaret looked like she was about to cry. Harold just nodded, as if Martin had said something he had been thinking, but hadn't known how to put into words. "Well," Harold said finally, "if you're serious about staying, I'll help you. I know some people, lawyers, people who can help with the paperwork. It won't be easy. But if you want it, we'll figure it out." Martin looked at Harold, then at Margaret, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The decision to stay wasn't popular. When Martin told the other prisoners, some of them called him a traitor. Others said he was running away, that he was abandoning his country when it needed him most. A few understood, but most didn't, because for them, going home was the only option. It was what you did. You went home. You rebuilt. You moved on. But Martin couldn't shake the feeling that going home would be moving backwards, not forwards. That returning to Germany would mean living in the shadow of the war for the rest of his life. That every conversation, every relationship, every moment would be tinged with the question, what did you do during the war? Where were you? What did you see? Here, in America, no one asked those questions. Or if they did, they asked them with curiosity, not accusation. They wanted to know about the war, yes, but they didn't hold it against him. They didn't see him as a monster. They saw him as a man who had been caught up in something bigger than himself, something he couldn't control, something he was trying to leave behind. One prisoner, a man named Joseph, a former factory worker from Berlin, confronted Martin in the barracks one night. "You're a coward," Joseph said, his voice sharp with anger. "You're running away." "Maybe," Martin said, "or maybe I'm just smart enough to know when to cut my losses." "Cut your losses? Your country is your country. You don't abandon it just because things are hard." "My country abandoned me," Martin said. "It sent me to fight a war I didn't believe in, for a cause I didn't understand, in the name of a man who cared nothing about me or anyone like me. Why do I owe it anything?" Joseph stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Because it's your home." "No," Martin said quietly. "It was my home, but home isn't a place. It's a feeling. And I haven't felt at home in Germany in 10 years, maybe longer. Maybe I never did." Joseph stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, shaking his head. But not everyone reacted with anger. A few prisoners came to Martin privately, asking him about the process, about whether they could stay too. They didn't say it out loud, but Martin could see it in their eyes. They were scared. Scared of going back. Scared of what they would find. Scared of living in a country that had been destroyed by the very ideology they had once believed in. One young man, barely 20, with a baby face and wide, frightened eyes, asked Martin, "Do you think we're bad people for wanting to stay?" Martin thought about it. Then he said, "I think we're human, and humans want to survive. And sometimes survival means leaving everything behind and starting over. There's no shame in that." The days passed. The camp continued to empty. Martin continued to work in the carpentry shop. building furniture, repairing buildings, doing the kind of quiet, honest labor that made him feel like he was contributing something to the world. And slowly, with Harold's help, he began the process of applying to stay in America. It wasn't easy. There were forms, interviews, background checks, questions about his service in the Wehrmacht, about what he had done, where he had been, whether he had been involved in any war crimes. Martin answered honestly. He had been a soldier. He had fought in France, in North Africa. He had followed orders, but he had never killed anyone, as far as he knew. He had been a driver, a mechanic, a support soldier. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man trying to stay alive. And somehow, miraculously, his application was approved. In December 1945, Martin Keller was released from Camp Concordia as a free man, and instead of boarding a train to New York to catch a ship back to Germany, he boarded a bus to Wichita, where Harold had arranged for him to work at a furniture factory. He never looked back. Martin wasn't alone. Thousands of German POWs chose to stay in America after the war. Some did it through official channels, applying for immigration status and working their way through the legal process. Others did it quietly, slipping through the cracks, disappearing into small towns where no one asked too many questions. By 1950, an estimated 5,000 former German POWs had settled permanently in the United States. They became farmers, mechanics, carpenters, teachers. They married American women. They had children. They built lives that had nothing to do with the war, nothing to do with Germany, nothing to do with the past they were trying to leave behind. For many Americans, this was controversial. How could the country allow former enemy soldiers to stay? How could they be trusted? What if they were still loyal to the Nazi cause? But the government understood something that many citizens didn't, that the best way to win a war isn't just to defeat your enemy on the battlefield, it's to show them that there's a better way to live. That democracy, for all its flaws, is better than tyranny. That freedom, for all its messiness, is better than control. That treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, is the most powerful weapon you have. And so the former prisoners were allowed to stay. They were monitored, yes. They were watched, but they were also given a chance to prove that they could be more than what they had been, that they could change, that they could become Americans. Martin worked at the furniture factory for 3 years, saving money, learning the trade, perfecting his English. He rented a small apartment in Wichita, a one-room place with a hot plate and a window that looked out onto a street where children played and neighbors waved, and life continued in a way that felt almost normal. In 1948, he met a woman named Ruth. She was a waitress at a diner near the factory, a small-town girl with dark hair and a quiet smile. She knew Martin was German. She knew he had been a POW, but she didn't care. Or rather, she cared, but not in the way Martin had feared. She asked him about it once, on their third date, and Martin told her the truth. About the war, about the propaganda, about the lies he had believed, and the moment he had realized they were lies. Ruth listened. Then she said, "Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them." They were married in 1949. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Martin opened his own carpentry shop in 1952, a small business that built custom furniture for local families. He became a citizen in 1955, standing in a courtroom in Kansas, and swearing an oath to a country that had once been his enemy and was now his home. He never forgot Germany. He kept a photograph of his parents on the mantel, a picture taken before the war, when the world still made sense. He tried to find them after the war, sending letters to the village, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might know what had happened. But he never got a response. He never knew if they were alive or dead. And eventually, he stopped looking. Because sometimes the not knowing is easier than the knowing. But he didn't regret his choice, not for a moment, because the life he built in America was a life he chose, not a life that was chosen for him, and that made all the difference. They called it captivity, but it was the freest Martin had ever felt. In Germany, his life had been controlled by forces beyond his comprehension, first by the state, which conscripted him at 23 and sent him to fight a war he didn't understand, then by the army, which told him where to go, what to do, who to kill, then by the Nazis, who told him what to think, what to believe, what to feel. But here in America, first as a prisoner, then as a free man, Martin had choices. Small choices, yes, but they were his. He could choose what to build. He could choose where to work. He could choose who to love. He could choose what kind of life he wanted to live. And the irony was impossible to ignore. The moment he became a prisoner was the moment he started to become free. Martin thought about this often, especially in the early years, when he was still adjusting to his new life. He would be working in his shop, planning a piece of wood or fitting a joint, and the thought would come to him unbidden, I am free, not because I escaped, not because I fought, but because I chose to stay in the cage. It made no sense, and yet it made perfect sense. Because the cage wasn't America. The cage was Germany. The cage was the ideology that had consumed his country, the propaganda that had poisoned his mind, the war that had stolen his youth, and the only way to escape that cage was to leave it behind entirely, to cross an ocean and never look back. One evening, years later, Martin was sitting on his porch with Ruth, watching their children play in the yard. The boy, named Harold, after the man who had helped Martin stay, was chasing the girl around a tree, both of them laughing, their voices high and bright and full of joy. Ruth turned to Martin and said, "Do you ever regret it, not going back?" Martin thought for a moment. Then he said, "Every day I think about what I left behind, my parents, my village, my country. But I don't regret it, because if I had gone back, I would have spent the rest of my life living in the past. And I didn't want that. I wanted a future, and I found it here." Ruth took his hand. "Do you feel American?" Martin laughed. "I don't know. I still dream in German. I still think in German. But when I wake up, I'm here, and that's enough." The truth was, Martin didn't feel fully American, but he didn't feel fully German anymore either. He was something in between, something new, an immigrant, a refugee, a man without a country who had found a home anyway. And maybe that was the point. Maybe home isn't about where you're born, or what language you speak, or what flag you salute. Maybe home is just the place where you feel like you can breathe, where you can be yourself, where you can build something that matters. For Martin, that place was America. Not because it was perfect, not because it was easy, but because it was his choice. And that choice, that single impossible choice to stay, had made all the difference. Martin Keller lived in Wichita for 53 years. He ran his carpentry shop until he was 80, when arthritis finally forced him to retire. He never became wealthy. He never became famous. He just lived. Quietly, honestly, building furniture and raising children and being a good neighbor and doing all the small, unremarkable things that make up a life. He never returned to Germany. He thought about it sometimes, especially in his later years, when his children would ask about his past. They wanted to visit, to see the village where he had grown up, to connect with the history he had left behind. But Martin always said no, not angrily, just firmly. That part of his life was over, and he didn't want to go back. In 2003, at the age of 92, Martin died in his sleep. Ruth had passed away 5 years earlier, and Martin had spent those final years in a small house near his son's farm, watching his grandchildren grow up, teaching them how to build things with their hands, telling them stories about a war he had tried so hard to forget. At his funeral, Harold, his son, stood at the podium and told the story of how Martin had stayed, how he had chosen America over Germany, how he had built a life from nothing. And at the end, Harold said something that Martin himself had never quite been able to put into words. "My father left Germany as a soldier. He arrived in America as a prisoner, and he died as a free man. Not because he escaped, but because he chose to stay. And in that choice, he found the only kind of freedom that matters, the freedom to decide who you want to be. Martin was buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Wichita, next to Ruth, under a headstone that read, Martin Keller, 1911-2003, carpenter, husband, father, American. American. That was the word his children had chosen for him, because even though Martin had been born in Germany, even though he had fought for Germany, even though he had spent the first 34 years of his life as a German, he had spent the last 58 years as an American. And in the end, that's what mattered. He left Germany as a soldier and found heaven in captivity. There is a lesson here, a lesson about home, about identity, about what it means to belong. We like to think of home as a fixed thing, a place, a country, a set of coordinates on a map. We like to think that where you're born determines who you are, that your nationality is your destiny, that you can't escape your origins, but Martin's story proves otherwise. Because home isn't a place, it's a feeling. It's the sense that you belong somewhere, that you're safe, that you can build a life that matters. And sometimes the place you're born isn't the place where you feel at home. Sometimes you have to leave everything behind and start over in a country that was supposed to be your enemy. The German POWs who stayed in America weren't traitors. They weren't cowards. They were survivors. They were men who looked at the wreckage of their lives and made a choice to rebuild somewhere new, to let go of the past and embrace a future that made no sense to anyone but them. And in making that choice, they became living proof that identity isn't fixed, that you can change, that you can become something other than what you were born to be, that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, about where we belong, about who our enemies are just stories, and stories can be rewritten. Martin Keller rewrote his story. He erased the soldier and replaced him with a carpenter. He erased the German and replaced him with an American. He erased the prisoner and replaced him with a free man. And in doing so, he proved that the most powerful form of freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the ability to choose your own story. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where millions of people are being forced to leave their homes, where refugees are being turned away at borders, where the idea of belonging is being used as a weapon to divide us, Martin's story matters more than ever. Because it reminds us that home isn't about where you're from. It's about where you're going. It's about the life you choose to build, the people you choose to love, the future you choose to create. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is leave everything behind and start over somewhere new. Martin understood that. Ruth understood that. And the thousands of former POWs who stayed in America understood that too. They learned it the hard way, through war and loss and exile. But they learned it. And because they learned it, the world became a little bit better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. And maybe that's the only thing we can ever hope for, that in the middle of the chaos, someone makes a choice, that in the middle of the destruction, someone decides to rebuild, that in the middle of the war, someone realizes that the enemy isn't the enemy. They're just people trying to find a place to call home. The Guard never sleeps, and neither should we. There are more stories like this one, stories of soldiers who became citizens, of enemies who became neighbors, of men who chose exile and found freedom. If this matters to you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and each story reveals something we thought we knew about war, about identity, about what it means to belong. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. We want to hear from you. Have you or your family ever had to choose between home and freedom? Share your story. If you know someone who's struggling with questions of identity, of belonging, of where they fit in this world, share this with them. Because the most dangerous prison isn't made of walls. It's made of the stories we're told about who we're supposed to be. And the only way to escape is to write your own story. The guard never sleeps.